Abraham Lincoln is one of the most well-known and loved presidents of the United States, as he is one of the major reasons slavery ended in the United States during the American Civil War. But what people don't realize is that his views during his lifetime had an ever-growing change towards slave freedom. Even his famed Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 had major limitations not many know today. So here's how Abraham Lincoln began the destruction of slavery. First off, why did Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Contrary to what many believe, Lincoln's initial goal at the beginning of the Civil War was simply the preservation of the Union, even stating so in his inaugural address. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." So getting rid of slavery would actually harm the chances of putting the country back together, as at that time the states would never come back willingly if slavery was gone immediately after seceding. But what were Lincoln's views on slavery before the Civil War? Well, Lincoln was never a fan of slavery, believing it to be immoral, stating in 1854, "If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another." He also stated in another quote, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." But Lincoln wasn't exactly an abolitionist either, as he was a staunch supporter of the Constitution, believing that the Constitution prevented a federal ban on slavery in existing states. He and many other Republicans primarily fought against the expansion of slavery, not the abolishment of it in existing states. He actually wasn't exactly sure what should be done with the slavery issue. In contrast, abolitionists knew exactly what should be done: abolish slavery. Lincoln hoped that the Republicans could eventually use the Constitution to cripple slavery so that it would no longer exist. In fact, before the Civil War, he didn't really believe black people should have the same rights as white people. In 1858, in a series of debates with his rival, Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's position was made clear, as Douglas had accused him of supporting Negro equality. In their fourth debate at Charleston, Illinois, Lincoln replied to this claim, stating, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." Lincoln mostly believed that black men had the right to improve their condition in society and to enjoy the fruits of their own labor. In fact, Lincoln was actually a fan of colonization, even as he was writing his proclamation in 1862, as he hosted a delegation of free black men and women at the White House in the hopes of getting their support on a plan for colonization, though since he angered so many black leaders and abolitionists, he never spoke of it again. So why again did Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, he wanted to preserve the Union peacefully above all else. But after years of bloody battles, the Union finally realized that peacefully reuniting the country would simply not happen. Their only chance was to forcibly defeat the Confederate forces into Reconstruction. While Lincoln did not like slavery, his proclamation was mostly for military reasons, as it solved many problems the Union had. You see, slavery wasn't just a huge component of the Southern economy, but also a huge part of their military. Slaves performed many tasks, including building fortifications, building railroads, cooking, and tending to the wounded. So while the South didn't use slaves as soldiers, their labor was incredibly important for the Confederates. So Lincoln's emancipation of their military labor force would greatly impede the South's ability to wage war. Much like Sherman, who destroyed the South's railroads and supply chains, Lincoln was attacking the South's supply of labor. However, the Union didn't just destroy the South's labor, they actively used it to their own benefit, as millions of former slaves began flocking to any military job to help the Union defeat the Confederates. Destroying the South's labor while gaining more was perhaps the most fundamental reason why the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Another problem the Union had that the proclamation solved was how to deal with the escaped slaves that came to the Union from the Confederacy during the Civil War. Many of them actually were listed as contraband. Union General Benjamin F. Butler, in particular, had a policy that claimed escaped slaves were contraband of war, which bypassed the fugitive slave law that required captured escaped slaves to return to their masters. Instead, Butler's policy allowed him to put these African American refugees to work for the good of the Union Army. But while they were still classified as property by the Union, they were not sent back to the South. Eventually, there was no need for this, as the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in the Confederate States, meaning if any slave escaped, they would become a free man in the Union. Courageously, many black men and women began to join the military in any job they could get. Another bonus of the proclamation was not only freeing the Confederate slaves, but also preventing the European powers from joining the Confederate States, as many of the European powers had already abolished slavery and did not want to be associated with the practice, especially if the other side, the Union, was fighting to abolish it. The proclamation may have been a strategic military measure for Lincoln and the Union, but to many, it was a complete change in their livelihood. Their life was theirs at last. They now had their freedom. So, if there were so many benefits to issuing it, then why did Lincoln wait so long? Well, the Union had not been as successful as they had hoped to have been during the first few years of the war. So to boost morale and solidify Lincoln's position, Secretary of State William Seward suggested waiting for a Union victory to officially issue the Emancipation, so that the Union would not look desperate. Their victory finally came on September 17th, on the bloodiest day in American history at the Battle of Antietam. Although basically ending in a draw, the battle drove the Confederates out of Maryland, a good enough result for the president, causing him to address a crowd on the White House balcony, stating, "I can only trust in God, I have made no mistake. It is now for the country and the world to pass judgment on it." However, there were actually two Emancipation Proclamations. The first one was the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862, which actually still hoped to end the fighting peacefully by stating that if the southern states did not cease their rebellion by January 1st, 1863, then the real Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect. When the Confederacy did not yield, Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which stated that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. But did you catch that? Within the rebellious states. Meaning the only slaves that were freed were the ones in states that didn't even recognize the president's authority. Unfortunately, the Emancipation Proclamation had some major limitations regarding absolute abolition. Being careful to respect the limits of his authority, Lincoln only applied the Emancipation Proclamation to the southern states in rebellion. He did so as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy under Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. Slave states that stayed with the Union, such as Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, were also exempt from slave abolition, as Lincoln feared such an aggressive issue would turn those states against the Union. Though Lincoln did encourage those border states to adopt abolition, which did eventually happen. Additionally, parts of the Confederacy that had already come under Northern control, such as parts of Louisiana and Virginia, were also exempt from slave abolition. Lincoln's power to issue the Emancipation Proclamation came from the executive branch, not the legislative, so he was only able to issue it by arguing that it would allow the Union to destroy their rebellion, furthering the fact that it was a military play, which is basically the only way it was constitutionally allowed. Despite not freeing every single slave in the United States, the proclamation still applied to more than 3.5 million of the 4 million enslaved people in the country. Around 25,000 to 75,000 were immediately emancipated in Confederate locations that were reconquered by the US Army. With every incursion into Confederate lands, the Union freed more and more slaves, many of whom joined as soldiers. Slowly but surely, the Union was destroying slavery. Previously, escaped slaves who went north were often under threat of being returned to their masters. Now, escaped slaves would be free, which encouraged many to attempt to escape, furthering the Confederates' labor shortage. So despite the limitations of absolute emancipation, Lincoln's proclamation was the first step towards absolute abolition. He realized it was just the first step, and that it would have to be followed by a constitutional amendment in order to guarantee the abolishment of slavery. In fact, Lincoln's views regarding black men and women changed throughout the Civil War, perhaps due to the bravery and valor they showed on and off the battlefield. While some might think I made this video to discredit Lincoln, I'm simply trying to educate more people into the insight of one of the most important documents in American history, and how it actually was more important, as it was one of the most crucial reasons why the Union won the war. The Emancipation Proclamation not only freed slaves itself, but almost more crucially, it gave the Union the firepower to defeat the Confederates in warfare, which eventually led to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Lincoln wasn't always the staunch abolitionist he is remembered as today, but you would be hard-pressed to find anyone in the 19th century with 21st century moral values. Despite his reasons for emancipation, Lincoln stands out because he did what every president before him couldn't do: destroy the horrific institution of slavery that had stained the United States. His Emancipation Proclamation definitively earns him the title, the Great Emancipator. Unfortunately, Lincoln will not see the end of slavery, as he was assassinated before the 13th Amendment was officially ratified. And if you want to learn more about Lincoln's assassination, be sure to check out my video here.